The vintage champagne for Victoria's estate wedding cost more than the specialized heart valve surgery keeping me alive. Emily knew it. She tracked the cost of every imported floral arrangement and silk tablecloth, yet she conveniently ignored the timeline of my failing heart. I was 19. My critical surgery was officially scheduled. Then Emily asked me, in her perfectly curated, calm voice, to push it back 2 months so the wedding photographs would not be ruined by my hospital stay. I complied, but the sealed folder, a 9-year-old boy handed me 10 years later, changed absolutely everything. Welcome back to the channel, where we tell the quiet stories of women who were underestimated by the people who should have loved them most. If a family ever made you feel like you had to earn your place at the table, drop a comment with your city and the time you are listening, and be sure to subscribe. The truth was finally awake. The Oregon coast is a place built for hiding. It is defined by heavy morning fog, salt-thick air, and a persistent quiet drizzle that washes away footprints. It was the exact opposite of the sun-drenched, hyper-visible wealth of the Napa Valley. That is precisely why I chose it. At 29 years old, I had built a solitary, ordered life inside a sprawling glass greenhouse. I spent my days surrounded by heirloom ferns, damp potting soil, and the predictable rhythm of germination. Plants made sense. They required care, water, and light, and in return, they simply grew. They never asked you to diminish yourself so they could look better in comparison. My body, however, was a constant, quiet reminder of the past. The decision to delay my heart valve surgery 10 years ago had not come without a permanent price. The delayed intervention had left me with a chronic reduction in stamina. If I carried too many heavy bags of soil, my chest would tighten and my breathing would turn shallow. I had to sit on a wooden stool, resting my hands on my knees, waiting for my irregular heartbeat to settle back into a safe rhythm. I accepted this physical limitation as the toll I paid to escape. It was a trade. I gave up a fraction of my physical strength in exchange for absolute psychological peace. I lived completely off the grid of my family's radar. I did not speak to Emily. I did not speak to Macario. I did not even refer to them as my mother and father in the privacy of my own thoughts. Those titles imply a bond of protection and unconditional care, things that had never existed in that California mansion. To me, they were simply Emily and Macario, two people who were entirely consumed by their own reflections in the mirror of high society. Victoria was just a phantom from another life, a golden child continuing to live in a golden cage. I believed I had successfully closed the door on their toxic world forever. I had changed my legal address, severed my name from their health insurance policies, and vanished into the damp green sanctuary of my own making. I was safe. My routine was untouchable. The pain of my youth was neatly archived on a dusty shelf in the back of my mind. Then the phone rang. It was exactly 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. The air inside the greenhouse was thick with humidity, and I was in the middle of pruning a row of delicate orchids when the old landline on the potting desk shrilled. It was an abrupt, jarring noise that did not belong in my quiet world. I wiped the damp soil from my hands onto my canvas apron, frowning at the caller identification display. It was a California area code. A deep, cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. For a fleeting second, I pictured Emily's polished voice demanding some impossible favor. I picked up the receiver cautiously. But the voice on the other end was male. It was deep, formal, and carried the distinct, measured cadence of a professional who delivers serious news for a living. He introduced himself as Winston, a senior attorney and the managing executor for a prominent legal firm based out of a county near Napa. He asked very politely if he was speaking to Kaylee, the biological granddaughter of Gianna. I froze. Hearing my grandmother's name spoken out loud in this distant Oregon town felt like a physical blow. Gianna was the only piece of my childhood that carried genuine warmth. I managed to whisper a confirmation. Winston released a long, heavy exhale into the receiver. "Miss," he said, his tone shifting from formal to remarkably intense. "Our office has been trying to locate you for an entire decade." I stared at the rows of green leaves in front of me, my mind struggling to process the math. A decade. I had never hidden my identity. I paid taxes. I held a commercial lease for my greenhouse. I had a library card. I told him there must be some sort of clerical error. I told him I had nothing to do with the estate, that I had walked away from that family empty-handed 10 years ago. Winston did not argue. He simply stated facts. He told me that there were documents that absolutely required my physical presence. He used terminology that felt heavy and dangerous. He spoke the words irrevocable trust. He spoke the words primary water source. He spoke the words sole legal ownership. None of it made sense. None of it aligned with the narrative I had been fed my entire life. The narrative that I was the useless leftover child who deserved nothing. My hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy metal pruning shears slipped from my grip. The shears hit the floor. The drive down the Pacific Coast Highway is a long, winding descent. As I steered my old truck south, the comforting gray fog of Oregon slowly burned away, replaced by the relentless golden glare of California. I had packed exactly one overnight bag. For hours, the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the endless loop of my own internal monologue. I had 10 hours to dissect Winston's phone call, 10 hours to confront the ghosts I thought I had buried. Why had I never asked questions? Why had I packed my single suitcase at 19 and just disappeared without demanding to know what Gianna had left behind? The answer was rooted in the psychology of the unwanted child. When you are raised by a woman like Emily, you are methodically trained to believe that taking up space is a burden. You are conditioned to expect nothing. You learn that your worth is strictly tied to how invisible and accommodating you can be. Fighting Emily meant fighting a hurricane, and you do not fight the weather. You just try to survive it by staying out of its path. But Winston's words had fundamentally altered the gravity of my past. Searching for a decade, a major legal firm with endless resources does not simply misplace the primary heir to a massive estate. They trace tax records, they trace utility bills. Unless, of course, someone with authority had deliberately and legally instructed them to stop looking. Someone who had the standing to confidently declare me missing. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It took a very specific kind of malice to intercept the legal destiny of a sick 19-year-old girl. It meant that while I was struggling to pay for basic cardiology appointments, measuring out my limited energy day by day, someone was sitting in a velvet-lined room actively burying the resources that belonged to me. I knew exactly who had orchestrated it. I knew exactly who had the arrogance to build a wall between me and my grandmother's legacy. I just had not wanted to believe that a mother's cruelty could run that deep, crossing the line from emotional neglect into calculated legal sabotage. I drove toward the truth. As the coastline gave way to the rolling, sun-baked hills of the wine country, the memories I had suppressed began to sharpen into vivid focus. I was 19 again. The Napa Valley summer heat was beating down on my shoulders. Inside the sprawling, air-conditioned main house, Emily was hosting a private fitting. Victoria was standing on a pedestal draped in imported silk, while Emily carefully selected diamond earrings to match the fabric. The room smelled of expensive perfume and unearned privilege. I was not inside. I was out in the dirt. I was kneeling in the dry California soil, my hands stained dark with earth, carefully tending to the oldest, most gnarled grapevines on the far edge of the property. My chest harbored a persistent, uncomfortable flutter, the quiet warning signs of my failing heart valve that Emily had deemed an inconvenience to her social calendar. Then the sound of motorized wheels crunched against the gravel. It was Gianna. My grandmother was physically frail, confined to her wheelchair, but her mind was as sharp as cut glass. She rolled past the grand terrace, completely ignoring the laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes echoing from Victoria's fitting. She parked her chair right next to my patch of dirt. Resting on her lap was a weathered, cylindrical leather tube. She unscrewed the cap and unrolled a massive, yellowed parchment across a wooden utility table. It was the original land registry map of the estate. Her thin fingers traced the faded blue ink lines that ran beneath the property. "Emily understands the labels on the bottles," Gianna said, her voice raspy but fierce. "She understands the diamonds and the silk. But they are all just dressing up a stage." She tapped the blue lines on the map. "You understand the soil, Kaylee. You understand that the grapes do not care about the parties. They care about the water table. The one who controls the primary water source controls the entire valley. Tall branches fall first, but deep roots survive the drought." Gianna knew that her own daughter Emily was a hollow vessel of vanity. She knew that the empire she had built was going to be bled dry to fund a lifestyle of pure ego. She sat there in the sweltering heat, watching me carefully pack soil around a fragile vine with my bare hands. She saw my true worth. It was a suffocatingly hot afternoon in late August. The California sun was baking the earth, and the air above the vineyards shimmered with heat waves. I was 19, kneeling in the dirt outside the main house, meticulously pruning a row of rose bushes. The physical labor distracted me from the erratic, heavy thudding of my own heart. Inside the sprawling, air-conditioned mansion, Emily and Macario were hosting an impromptu tasting for a local distributor. The French doors leading to the terrace were wide open. Then, the shrill ring of the kitchen telephone cut through the heavy summer air. I paused, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my canvas glove. The phone rang 3 times before Emily answered. She put it on speakerphone likely, so she would not have to interrupt her conversation with Macario, who was swirling a glass of deep red vintage. From the terrace, I heard the faint, rasping sound of a woman struggling to pull air into her lungs. It was Gianna. She was calling from the annex at the edge of the property. "Oh, mother," Emily sighed. Her voice was dripping with that specific polished condescension she reserved for people she deemed inconvenient. "Is it the senile paranoia again? You are just working yourself into a panic over the heat. You love the attention, don't you?" Gianna's voice crackled through the speaker, barely more than a wheeze. She was asking for an ambulance. She was asking for her son. Macario took a slow sip of his wine. He did not even look at the phone. "She just wants someone to sit with her," he muttered to Emily. "Tell her we are busy. Rest for an hour, mother." "You will be fine," Emily said smoothly. "We are in the middle of a business discussion. I simply do not have the time for these theatrical performances today." I dropped my pruning shears. The panic hit my chest so hard I staggered. I did not care that my boots were coated in mud or that my hands were filthy. I sprinted across the pristine terrace and burst into the kitchen. My heart was hammering a dangerous, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I looked at Emily, then at Macario. They were completely unbothered, annoyed only by my sudden entrance. "Mom," I yelled, my voice breaking with sheer terror. "She is failing. We have to go over there right now. Call an ambulance." Emily turned around slowly. Her eyes scanned my muddy clothes, her upper lip curling in disgust. To her, my panic was not a plea to save a dying woman. It was a breach of protocol. It was the unacceptable crime of a low-status child raising her voice to the matriarch of the house. She walked over to me. She did not say a word. She simply raised her hand and delivered a sharp, calculating slap across my face. The sound cracked through the massive kitchen, echoing off the marble countertops. The physical sting was sharp, but the psychological intent was far heavier. It was designed to put me back in my place. It was the ultimate enforcement of the invisible chain I had worn my entire life. When you are raised as the scapegoat, you are conditioned to believe that you are fundamentally flawed. You learned helplessness. The standard reaction to that slap would have been to lower my head, to apologize for tracking mud into the house, to beg for forgiveness for being too loud, too emotional, too much. That was the script Emily had written for me. But standing there in that pristine kitchen with the phantom echo of Gianna's dying breath in my ears, I stopped reading from her script. I did not reach up to touch my cheek. I did not shed a single tear. Crying implies a desire to be comforted by the person who hurt you. And in that exact second, I realized I wanted absolutely nothing from this woman ever again. I just stood perfectly still. I leveled my gaze and stared directly into Emily's eyes. It was a cold, unwavering, dead silent stare. I looked right through her expensive veneer, right through the tailored clothes down to the hollow. Terrifying emptiness inside her. The silence stretched. It grew heavy. It grew suffocating. For the first time in her life, Emily looked physically uncomfortable. Her hand twitched at her side. She had expected submission. She was entirely unprepared for absolute defiance. Macario shifted his weight, clearing his throat to break the unbearable tension. He refused to look me in the eye. "Your grandmother has been having nervous spells all week," he muttered to his wine glass. "If you have so much free time on your hands, go over there and check on her yourself." I did not nod. I did not speak. I just turned around and ran. The air inside the annex was stale, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. I pushed the heavy oak door open and found Gianna slumped in her armchair near the window. Her face was the color of ash and her chest heaved with a terrifying, shallow rhythm. I dropped to my knees beside her, my muddy hands grabbing her cold, frail fingers. I told her I was calling the paramedics. I reached for the telephone on the side table, my fingers fumbling with the receiver. Gianna's grip suddenly tightened. For a woman whose heart was actively failing, her grip was startlingly fierce. "No," she wheezed. She pulled my hand away from the phone. Her eyes sunken, but sharp as obsidian, locked onto mine. "Not yet." "Grandma, you can't breathe," I pleaded, tears finally breaking my stoic facade. "They did not come," she stated. It was not a question. It was a final, damning verdict. She had heard the silence on the other end of the line. She knew her son and her daughter-in-law had chosen their wine over her life. She looked down at my hands, covered in the rich, dark soil of the vineyard she had spent her life cultivating. Then she looked at my face, still bearing the faint red mark of Emily's slap. Gianna pointed a trembling finger toward the heavy mahogany desk in the corner of the room. "The bottom drawer," she whispered, her voice rough with effort. "The leather book. Bring it here." I scrambled to the desk, pulled the drawer open, and found a small black leather-bound book containing a list of private contacts. I brought it back to her. "Dial," she commanded. "The number for Winston. Put it on speaker." I dialed the numbers with shaking fingers. When the deep professional voice of the attorney answered on the second ring, Gianna leaned toward the phone. She did not ask for medical help. She did not waste her final breaths on fear. Instead, with a clarity and authority that defied her failing body, she issued a series of rapid, absolute legal directives. I sat on the floor listening to terminology I did not fully understand, but the gravity in the room was unmistakable. She was permanently altering the landscape of the Napa Valley. She was locking the gates, and Emily had absolutely no idea. Gianna passed away in the ambulance 20 minutes later. Her funeral was an exercise in high society public relations. Emily wore a custom-tailored black dress and accepted condolences with the perfect, measured grace of a grieving daughter-in-law. Macario gave a eulogy about family values that sounded like it had been written by a marketing firm. I stood in the back row wearing a simple black cardigan, listening to the hollow words echo across the cemetery. A week after the funeral, my own medical reality could no longer be ignored. My failing heart valve was causing severe fatigue, and the numbers on my charts were slipping into a critical zone. My cardiologist had circled a Tuesday in late September for the specialized surgery. It was recorded in blue ink on the kitchen calendar. It was my ticket to breathing normally again. Then came the collision of schedules. Victoria's wedding, a $1 million spectacle meant to secure the family's status among California's elite, was slated for the second week of October. Emily brought it up on a Sunday morning. She was sitting at the marble kitchen island reviewing caterer contracts and floral spreadsheets. She did not look up from her paperwork. Using her calmest, most reasonable tone, she suggested that my surgery was simply poorly timed. "We are hosting 300 people, Kaylee," she said, her pen gliding smoothly over a linen sample. "I cannot manage a post-operative patient while directing a wedding of this scale. Furthermore, you cannot appear in the family portraits looking pale and hooked up to a portable monitor. It would completely ruin the aesthetic." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline of a very dark joke. There was none. "Just push it back 2 months," she commanded softly. "Don't be so dramatic about the timeline. Your sister only gets married once." Macario studied his morning newspaper, entirely absorbed in the stock index. I was 19. I was still on their health insurance. I was legally an adult, but financially trapped in their web. Without Macario's authorization on the insurance policy, the hospital would not proceed. The delay was not a request. It was an edict. I attended the wedding. I played my part. The estate was transformed into a paradise of white silk cascading imported orchids and towers of vintage champagne. There were photographers flown in from New York and a string quartet playing softly under the California stars. Victoria floated through the crowds in a gown that cost more than a luxury vehicle. Emily glowed, accepting compliments as if she had personally invented romance. I sat at a table near the back. I was wearing a cheap borrowed dress with long sleeves. Under the fabric of my right arm, strapped tightly to my bicep, was a portable Holter monitor tracking my erratic heart rhythm. The heat of the evening and the noise of the crowd made my chest tighten. Every breath felt like pulling air through a wet sponge. I watched Emily proudly recount the price of the champagne to a group of investors. She knew the cost down to the penny. She recited it like poetry. Nobody at that table knew the price of my cardiology appointments. Nobody knew that my life was currently paused so her photographs could be flawless. I did not cry. I simply observed. I looked at the champagne, the diamonds, and the forced smiles, and I realized with absolute chilling clarity that I was a prop in their stage play. If I died, I would merely be an inconvenience to the catering schedule. My surgery finally took place 2 months later. The delay had consequences. The prolonged strain on my heart muscle left me with a permanent reduction in stamina. The doctor called it a manageable chronic condition. I called it the permanent scar of being Emily's daughter. I spent a week in a sterile hospital room. Emily sent flowers with a card written in her assistant's handwriting. Victoria was on her honeymoon in the Maldives. Macario never visited. I realized then that the only way to survive a burning house is to stop asking the fire to keep you warm. When I was finally discharged and could walk without the room spinning, I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like a massive, quiet exhalation. I did not stage a dramatic confrontation. I did not scream at Emily or demand an apology from Macario. Apologies from people like them are just strategic maneuvers, swans folded out of paper napkins to make themselves look good. You cannot negotiate with people who view your heartbeat as a scheduling conflict. I walked into my childhood bedroom and pulled a single sturdy suitcase from the closet. I packed practical clothes, my boots, my gardening gloves, and a few books. I left the expensive jewelry Emily had bought for me to wear to public events. I left the designer coats. I left everything that had strings attached. Before I left the house, I logged onto the family computer. I methodically unlinked my name from their health insurance portal. I drafted a formal change of address form for the Federal Postal Service, redirecting all my mail to a temporary post office box in Oregon. It was an administrative task, cold and orderly. I had no idea that this single piece of federal paperwork would one day become the weapon that would dismantle their entire empire. I walked down the grand staircase. Emily was in the sunroom, arguing with a decorator on the phone. Macario was at his country club. Neither of them saw me leave. I walked out the heavy front doors, stepped into my battered truck, and put the key in the ignition. I drove past the sprawling vineyards that Gianna had built past the iron gates and onto the highway heading north. I did not look in the rearview mirror. The heavy polished doors of the Napa estate clicked shut behind me, and I honestly believed I had locked them forever. Healing is not a loud or sudden event. It is a slow, quiet accumulation of ordinary days. Over the next 10 years in Oregon, I built my greenhouse business from the ground up. I did not post photographs of my achievements on the internet. I did not send updates to my family to prove my worth. I simply focused on the soil, the humidity, and the steady, predictable growth of the plants under my care. My hands were often stained with earth, but my mind was entirely my own. The chronic fatigue from my delayed heart surgery was a constant companion, but in the quiet of the greenhouse, I could manage my own pace. I was safe. The only piece of news that ever managed to breach my carefully constructed walls was about Victoria. A distant cousin, unaware of the depth of our estrangement, forwarded me a photograph. Victoria had given birth to a son named Noah. In the picture, the boy was perhaps 4 years old, dressed in a rigid miniature tuxedo for some estate gala. He had dark, intelligent eyes that looked entirely too serious for a child his age. Looking at that photograph on my potting bench, my chest ached. I knew exactly what kind of conditional love he was being groomed to accept. I knew the exact weight of the expectations resting on his small shoulders, but I did not reach out. You cannot rescue someone else from a drowning ship when you are still learning how to swim. I filed the photograph away in a drawer and went back to my plants. I maintained my absolute boundary. That boundary remained unbroken until the morning Winston called. Now, after driving for countless hours down the Pacific coast, the dense pine forests of Oregon had fully surrendered to the golden-baked hills of California. The isolation of the past decade was over. I pulled my battered truck into a parking space in front of a brick building. I turned off the ignition. The drive was finished. Winston's law office was located in a quiet, unpretentious building, 2 towns over from the Napa Valley. It was the exact opposite of the environments Emily preferred. There were no vaulted ceilings, no imported marble floors, and no receptionists hired purely for their aesthetic appeal. The office smelled of old paper binding glue and dark roasted coffee. It was a place where serious, unglamorous work was done. Stepping inside, I felt an immediate, strange sense of comfort. Winston was a man in his late 30s with a calm, analytical demeanor. He wore a simple, well-tailored suit, and his desk was impeccably organized. He stood up when I entered, offering a firm, respectful handshake. He did not look at my faded jeans or my scuffed boots. He looked directly into my eyes, assessing me with the quiet intelligence of a man who has seen every ugly variation of human greed. He gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite his desk. Between us lay a remarkably thick manila folder. It looked heavy. It looked like a decade of buried secrets condensed into legal parchment. "I am glad you made the drive," Kaylee Winston said quietly. He placed his hands flat on the desk. He did not offer small talk or empty pleasantries. He simply slid the heavy folder across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of me. "I could have summarized this over the telephone," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "but you need to read these words for yourself." I reached out and touched the edge of the folder. Before my fingers could even flip the heavy cover of the folder open, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden desk. The screen lit up. It was a text message. It was from a number I had not seen in 10 years, but I recognized it instantly. It was Emily. For a decade, there had been absolute silence. No birthday cards, no holiday greetings, no inquiries about my heart condition. And now, on the exact day I was sitting in the executor's office, a message appeared. The timing was not a coincidence. It was the desperate, flailing maneuver of a predator sensing a trap. The text was written in her signature, breezy, authoritative tone. "Darling, hoping you are well up in Oregon. The family is finalizing some minor tax restructuring for the estate this week. There is an outdated, purely technical document with your name on it that is holding up our accountants. I am having my assistant overnight it to you. Just sign the highlighted line and return it. I will wire you $1,000 for the inconvenience. Love, Mom." I stared at the glowing screen. $1,000. She was offering me $1,000 to blindly sign a legal waiver. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it made my heart pound, not with fear, but with a sudden, icy clarity. They did not know I was here, but their own legal team had clearly warned them that the new executor was closing in on my actual location. Emily was trying to buy my shadow before I could step into the light. I did not reply to the message. Instead, I picked up the phone and turned the screen toward Winston. I let him read the text. Winston's expression did not change, but a shadow of profound professional disgust settled in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "They are panicking," Winston stated, his voice completely level. The previous attorney handling this estate passed away, and the files were stagnant. When my firm took over the mandate last month, I immediately initiated a standard skip trace. I found your commercial lease in Oregon within 2 days. Emily's attorneys likely received a notification that the executor was finally moving on the file. He tapped a pen against the desk. "That text message is a sloppy, desperate attempt to get you to sign a quitclaim deed. They want you to formally waive your rights to an inheritance you do not even know you possess." The people who had treated my life as a scheduling inconvenience were now terrified of my signature. I reached out, turned my phone face down on the desk, and silenced it completely. I looked at Winston, my voice steadier than it had been in my entire life. "Show me what she is trying to buy for $1,000, I said. "If you believe that true karma comes quietly wrapped in legal documents rather than screaming matches, hit the like button. Let me know in the comments how you would react if you saw that text message from a mother who abandoned you." Winston opened the folder. The first document was printed on heavy cream-colored paper. It was Gianna's last will and testament, accompanied by the establishment of an irrevocable trust. The dates at the top of the pages were staggering. They were signed, witnessed, and fully executed during the exact week I had been kneeling in the dirt the week before Gianna died. I read the paragraphs slowly. The legal terminology was dense, but the ultimate meaning was blindingly clear. Gianna had not divided her assets. She had not left a symbolic gesture or a minor cash payout. She had named me Kaylee as the sole absolute beneficiary of the trust. The total valuation of the assets enclosed within the trust was $45 million. But the cash was merely a fraction of the power. Gianna had deliberately carved out the core infrastructure of the Napa estate. The trust granted me sole ownership of the primary land parcels. More importantly, it granted me the absolute unchallengeable legal rights to the primary subterranean water source that fed the entire valley. I stopped breathing for a moment. For 10 years, Emily and Macario had been hosting their lavish galas. They had been expanding their brand, drinking vintage wine, and looking down on the world. But legally, functionally, and entirely, they had been doing it on my land. They were watering their precious vines with my water. They were nothing but high society squatters living inside an illusion that Gianna had intentionally left in my hands to destroy at will. But if this document was legally binding 10 years ago, how had they kept it buried for so long? I looked up at Winston, the question burning in my throat. If I was the named beneficiary, the original law firm would have been legally obligated to notify me immediately upon Gianna's passing. Winston nodded. He anticipated the question. He turned to the second section of the heavy folder. Inside were dozens of small green rectangular cards. They were return receipt cards from the Federal Postal Service, the kind attached to certified legal mail that requires a physical signature upon delivery. The previous executor sent the notifications. Winston explained, his tone shifting into the precise clinical delivery of a seasoned prosecutor. He sent them to your last known legal address, the Napa estate. I looked down at the green cards. My stomach plummeted. In the small box designated for the recipient's signature, I saw the elegant, looping, cursive handwriting I had known my entire life. It was Emily's signature. She had stood at the front door of that mansion and personally signed for certified legal documents addressed to me. She had accepted them. Then, according to the executor's notes printed on the next page, Emily had formally informed the law office that I had severed ties with the family relocated without a forwarding address and was entirely unreachable. This is not a family misunderstanding, Winston said, leaning forward, ensuring I grasped the absolute power of the papers in front of me. An irrevocable trust cannot be altered or broken by Macario or Emily. It is ironclad. Furthermore, intercepting certified legal mail to deliberately misappropriate an inheritance is not a civil dispute. He paused, letting the weight of the law settle into the room. It is federal mail fraud. It is a severe federal crime. They cannot buy their way out of a federal postal inspector's investigation. Emily had not just stolen my money. She had committed a felony to ensure I remained poor, sick, and subservient. She had signed her own spectacular downfall with her favorite fountain pen. The weapon was fully loaded. I sat in Winston's dusty office staring at the staggering numbers printed on the valuation reports. $45 million. It was a sum of money that could buy politicians, dictate social hierarchies, and fund an endless stream of million-dollar weddings. It was the exact currency Emily had used to measure human worth her entire life. Most people, upon discovering they had been robbed of a massive fortune, would immediately demand the funds be transferred into their own accounts. They would want to feel the weight of the gold. They would want the power. But as I looked at the crisp white paper, I did not feel powerful. I felt the phantom sting of Emily's slap against my cheek. I heard the rasping, desperate sound of Gianna struggling for air, while Macario casually sipped his vintage red wine. This money was the poison that had rotted the foundation of that house. It was the reason a sick 19-year-old girl had been viewed as an unacceptable inconvenience. I realized with absolute clarity that if I kept the money, I would constantly be tempted to use it as a ruler to measure them, effectively handing the psychological control right back to Emily. I looked across the desk at Winston. I do not want to hold this, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. If I walk into that house holding $45 million, she will try to bargain with me. She will try to manipulate the narrative. I need to make it impossible for her to negotiate. Winston raised an eyebrow, his professional curiosity piqued. What are your instructions, Kaylee? I told him to immediately draft a permanent transfer of assets. I instructed him to move the entirety of the irrevocable trust, the land, the brand, and the subterranean water rights into a newly formed nonprofit agricultural foundation dedicated to teaching at-risk youth sustainable farming. I wanted the estate to be stripped from Emily's manicured hands and given to kids who actually knew what it meant to have dirt under their fingernails. Winston worked with breathtaking speed. An hour later, he placed the final transfer documents in front of me. I picked up the heavy brass pen. I did not hesitate. I signed my name on every designated line, methodically moving the entire empire out of my own reach. When the ink dried, an incredible lightness washed over my chest. There was nothing left to divide. There was nothing left to steal. The weapon was fully armed. And I had intentionally locked the safety so Emily could never disarm it. It was time to drive home. We are moments away from the confrontation. Have you ever had to walk back into a toxic room holding the ultimate truth? Tell me your story in the comments below. I picked up the briefcase. The drive from Winston's office to the estate took less than 40 minutes, but it felt like traversing a bridge between two entirely different dimensions. I turned my battered truck onto the familiar winding road lined with ancient oak trees. The heavy iron gates of the Napa estate loomed ahead. They were still just as imposing, still meticulously polished, designed specifically to keep the elite insulated from the ordinary world. The security camera blinked at me. I gave my name through the intercom, and after a long, confused pause from the new security guard, the gates slowly swung open. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I navigated the long driveway. The sprawling mansion looked exactly the same. The hedges were perfectly manicured into sharp geometric shapes. The imported marble fountain bubbled in the center of the courtyard. It was a flawless, beautiful monument built entirely on a foundation of theft and federal fraud. I parked my dusty truck directly behind Macario's pristine luxury sedan, grabbed the leather briefcase from the passenger seat, and walked up the wide stone steps. I did not have to knock. Before my knuckles even touched the heavy mahogany door, it swung open from the inside. Standing in the grand foyer was not Emily, nor was it a hired housekeeper. It was a 9-year-old boy. He had dark, intelligent eyes and was wearing a stiff, uncomfortable-looking collared shirt. He was holding a thick, illustrated book about native California botany tightly against his chest, as if it were a shield. It was Noah Victoria's son. "Are you the aunt?" he asked, his voice small and remarkably serious. I stopped. Looking down at him was like looking into a temporal mirror. I saw the exact same hyper-vigilant posture I had maintained at his age. I saw a child who was actively trying to take up as little space as possible in a house that demanded perfection. He was the next vulnerable victim of Emily's psychological machinery. He was the reason this empire needed to be dismantled today. "Yes, Noah," I said softly, giving him a gentle, reassuring smile. "I am." He stepped aside to let me enter his eyes, dropping back to the floor. I walked past him, the heavy leather briefcase securely in my grip. I knew exactly where to find them. The parlor awaited. The main parlor smelled of expensive bergamot tea and suffocating pretense. Emily, Macario, and Victoria were arranged around the glass coffee table, like actors waiting for a curtain call in a stage play. Emily sat perfectly straight on the velvet sofa, her hair flawlessly styled, holding a delicate china teacup. Macario was slouched in a leather armchair, casually scrolling through his smartphone. Victoria hovered near the window, looking bored and irritated, draped in a designer silk blouse. When I walked into the room, the performance immediately began. Kaylee, Emily said, adopting her signature velvety voice, the tone she used when she wanted to appear magnanimous. She did not stand up. We were surprised by the gate security. "After a decade of silence, I am glad you have finally come to your senses. We are willing to let the past go and welcome you back, provided you drop this childish rebellion." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She was framing my return as a surrender. She was graciously offering to forgive me for the crime of surviving her abuse. 10 years ago, that voice would have made my hands shake. Today, it sounded thin, reedy, and profoundly pathetic. I did not sit down. I did not accept the subtle invitation to join their circle. I walked straight to the center of the room and looked at the three of them. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of anger. Anger requires emotional investment, and I had entirely bankrupted my account with these people. "I am not here to join you for tea, Emily," I said. My voice was level, clinical, and precise. I placed Winston's heavy leather briefcase onto the center of the fragile glass coffee table. The dull, heavy thud of the leather hitting the glass echoed sharply, shattering the manufactured peace of the room. Macario finally looked up from his phone, a frown creasing his forehead. Victoria crossed her arms defensively. Emily's smile faltered just for a fraction of a second before she smoothed it back into place. "What is this dramatic display, Kaylee?" I unsnapped the brass locks. I opened the briefcase and extracted the thick stack of legal parchment. I did not hand it to her. I held it up, ensuring the official notary seals were visible. "This is the irrevocable trust established by Gianna 3 days before she died." I stated, my tone remaining completely flat. "It grants me Kaylee sole unchallengeable legal ownership of the core estate. That includes the land we are currently standing on and the subterranean water rights that have been keeping your vineyards alive for the past 10 years. The room went instantly, horrifyingly still. Victoria's mouth opened slightly. Macario dropped his phone onto his lap, his posture suddenly rigid. Emily let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a bark. "That is absurd. That is a fraudulent document. Our lawyers settled Gianna's estate a decade ago. You vanished. You have absolutely no legal standing here. I did not vanish, I replied, maintaining absolute eye contact. I filed a legal change of address with the Federal Postal Service. The previous executor sent multiple certified legal notifications regarding this exact trust to this exact address. I reached back into the briefcase. I pulled out the stack of green postal return receipt cards. I fanned them out across the glass table right next to Emily's teacup. And you signed for every single one of them, I said. There is your signature, Emily, over and over again. You intercepted certified legal mail meant to notify a 19-year-old girl of her inheritance, and then you lied to the executor to steal her assets. The color drained from Emily's face with shocking speed. Her flawless complexion turned a sickly shade of gray. She stared down at the green cards, her own looping handwriting staring back at her like an inescapable verdict. She was suddenly realizing that she had not just committed a moral sin, she had stepped into a federal trap. Victoria let out a panicked gasp, stepping away from the window. "Mom, what is she talking about? Did you hide her money?" The illusion was shattering. Emily's hands began to shake so badly that her teacup rattled against the saucer. The polished matriarch was disintegrating before my eyes. She scrambled to regain control her brain, frantically searching for a way to manipulate the numbers. "All right," Emily stammered, her voice dropping its velvety pretense and taking on a desperate, raspy edge. "All right, Kaylee, let us not be rash. We are still a family. The estate has grown significantly under Macario's management. We can bring the lawyers in tomorrow. We can divide the assets fairly, a quarter for each of us. You will be wealthier than you ever imagined." She was bargaining. She was trying to buy her way out of a federal crime with my own stolen money. Victoria began to cry openly, realizing that her designer lifestyle, her $1 million wedding, and her entire social identity had been entirely funded by theft. I looked at Emily's shaking hands. I looked at Macario, who was now sweating profusely, calculating the sheer magnitude of the financial ruin bearing down on him. "You do not seem to understand the situation," I said quietly. A faint, serene smile finally touched my lips. "There is nothing to divide." I pulled the final document from the briefcase and laid it carefully on top of the green postal receipts. It was the transfer agreement I had signed in Winston's office. 2 hours ago, I legally transferred the entirety of the trust, the land, the water rights, and the brand into a non-profit agricultural foundation, I explained, watching the absolute devastation register in their eyes. "You do not own this house. You do not own the water. You are simply unauthorized tenants living on charity land. And the foundation's board will be serving you with an eviction notice by Friday." Emily let out a guttural, raw sound of pure disbelief. "You gave it away. After everything we built, you threw $45 million away. You threw it away 10 years ago," I replied softly. "I merely decided where it landed. The checkmate was absolute. When a predator realizes it is cornered, it does not surrender gracefully. It thrashes." Emily lunged forward, sweeping her arm across the glass table. The teacup shattered against the marble floor, and the legal documents scattered. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, vicious rage. "You think you have won," she screamed, the sound echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. "I will tie you up in litigation for the rest of your miserable life. I will call my legal team right now. We will sue you for extortion. We will claim adverse possession of this land. You abandoned this property for 10 years. No judge in California will hand this back to a vindictive runaway." She snatched her smartphone from the sofa, cushions her fingers, jabbing frantically at the screen to dial her elite attorneys. It was the classic false counterattack. She truly believed that because she had money and connections, she could bend the law to her will and crush me one last time. I did not flinch. I did not try to stop her from making the call. I simply reached into the inner pocket of the briefcase and withdrew one final single sheet of paper. It bore the heavy red seal of the federal government. "Call them," I said calmly. "But before you do, you should read the preliminary evaluation from the federal postal inspector." Emily froze the phone, hovering inches from her ear. "Winston submitted these forged return receipts to federal authorities yesterday." I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "Adverse possession requires lawful entry. You committed a felony to secure your claim. Extortion is a threat. I am simply delivering the weather report. Federal mail fraud carries a penalty of up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Your lawyers cannot write a check to the federal government to make this disappear. The phone slipped from Emily's trembling fingers and hit the rug with a soft thud. The fight drained out of her body all at once. She collapsed back onto the velvet sofa, her eyes wide, staring at the red seal on the paper. There was no argument left. There were no more manipulations. There was only the cold, inescapable math of the law. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The silence in the grand parlor was heavy, absolute, and profoundly final. I did not stay to watch them try to piece their shattered illusions back together. When the foundation of your entire life is built on stolen wealth and federal fraud, the collapse is never a graceful event. It is ugly, loud, and desperate. I heard Victoria begin to weep, a harsh, jagged sound that had nothing to do with genuine sadness and everything to do with the sudden, terrifying loss of her velvet cage. Macario was pacing the floor, muttering frantic calculations about liquidating assets, entirely missing the point that financial accountants cannot fix a federal postal inspector's criminal mandate. Emily simply sat on the sofa. She was staring at the forged green postal receipts, her hands still trembling in her lap. The woman who had treated my failing heart as a minor scheduling conflict was now paralyzed by her own paperwork. I picked up my empty leather briefcase. I turned my back to them and walked out of the room. I did not feel the need to deliver a dramatic parting speech or demand a tearful apology. Silence is always the most punishing response you can give to people who thrive on manipulation. I walked across the massive marble foyer. The heavy mahogany front door felt lighter than it ever had before. I pulled it open and stepped out into the warm California evening. Standing on the front portico, waiting quietly by the stone columns, was Noah. He was still clutching his thick botanical book against his chest. He looked up at me, his dark eyes wide and searching. He had heard the shouting echoing from the parlor. He was incredibly young, but he understood that the weather in the house had permanently changed. I knelt down on the stone steps, so I was entirely at his eye level. I did not touch his shoulder, respecting the rigid, formal boundaries he had been taught since birth. "Noah," I said, my voice soft and deliberately steady, "I live in Oregon now. I have a very large greenhouse with hundreds of plants. It is very quiet there. If you ever feel like this house is too loud, or if you ever just want a safe place to learn about the soil, you know exactly where to find me." I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved a simple white business card with my address printed on it, and slid it gently into the pages of his book. He looked at the card, then looked back up at me and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. I stood up, walked down the driveway, and climbed into my truck. I turned the ignition, pulling away from the estate for the very last time. The gates closed behind me. Time moves entirely differently when you are no longer holding your breath. 6 months after I left that leather briefcase on the glass coffee table, the landscape of the Napa Valley had fundamentally shifted. The sprawling estate was no longer a playground for the incredibly elite. The iron gates had been stripped of the family crest and now bore a simple, dignified wooden sign, the Gianna Youth Agricultural Foundation. The nonprofit was fully operational and thriving. Every single week, dozens of at-risk teenagers walked those pristine fields. They were learning how to test the soil, how to prune the ancient vines, and how to cultivate crops sustainably. They were learning the exact lessons Gianna had tried to teach me in the dirt all those years ago. The land was finally serving a purpose greater than human vanity. As for Emily and Macario, their descent was swift, absolute, and entirely legal. Without the massive trust fund to mask their mounting debts, their financial house of cards completely collapsed. They were formally evicted and forced to vacate the estate within 30 days. They currently reside in a modest, cramped apartment in a neighboring, unremarkable town. They have been completely ostracized from their high society social circles. The federal investigation into the mail fraud is ongoing, a permanent, terrifying cloud hanging over their daily lives. They are learning the hard way that you cannot manipulate the federal government with a polite smile and an expensive dress. I did not stay in California to watch their ruin. I returned to the damp, quiet coast of Oregon. My greenhouse business was flourishing. The chronic fatigue in my chest was still there, a permanent physical reminder of the surgery I had been forced to delay, but the air I was breathing was finally clean. I spent my mornings repotting rare ferns and my afternoons tracking the slow, beautiful growth of my orchids. I had intentionally traded $45 million for absolute psychological peace, and I considered it the greatest bargain of my entire life. I had built a sanctuary where nothing was expected to perform for an audience, where everything was simply allowed to grow at its own natural, unhurried pace. My roots were finally secure. Forgiveness is a deeply misunderstood concept. People often confuse forgiveness with a total erasure of boundaries, assuming that to truly heal, you must allow toxic individuals back to your dinner table. I fundamentally reject that premise. You can find absolute peace without ever letting the arsonist back into your rebuilt house. I will never have a relationship with Emily or Macario. That specific door is permanently sealed with heavy steel locks. But life has a curious way of leaving small windows cracked open for the innocent. It was a Saturday morning, the air crisp and smelling heavily of salt water, when a modest sedan pulled up the gravel driveway of my Oregon nursery. I set down my watering can and walked out of the warm greenhouse. Victoria stepped out of the driver's side. She was wearing simple denim jeans and a plain woven sweater. The expensive designer labels were gone, and the arrogant golden child posture had entirely evaporated. She looked exhausted, significantly older, and profoundly humbled by the stark reality of the past 6 months. She was not alone. The rear passenger door opened, and Noah stepped out. He was holding the exact same botanical book I had seen in Napa. Victoria did not try to hug me. She did not offer a tearful, dramatic apology for her role in my pain. She simply looked at the massive glass greenhouse, then looked at me, her eyes filled with a quiet, conditional respect. "He wanted to see the plants," she said softly. I nodded. I led them inside. We did not discuss the trust fund. We did not discuss the pending federal investigation or the spectacular fall of our parents. We simply walked through the humid rows of green leaves in absolute silence. I showed Noah how to test the moisture of the potting soil with his bare fingers. Victoria stood in the background watching us without saying a word. I will never be best friends with my sister. The historical damage is simply too deep. But as I watched Noah carefully pack soil around a fragile seedling, watching his small, tense shoulders finally relax in the quiet warmth of the greenhouse, I knew the real victory had been won. The toxic cycle was broken. There is a persistent, dangerous myth that a family legacy is defined by the physical things you inherit. Society tells you it is about the money, the sprawling estates, the last names printed on polished brass plaques, and the expensive heirlooms passed down through generations. They are entirely wrong. A true legacy is not defined by what you are handed. It is defined by the things you actively choose to protect. I am 29 years old. I live with a permanently compromised heart valve because my physical survival was once deemed less valuable than a catered wedding reception. But I am still here. If you are sitting in the dark right now, feeling like you are fundamentally flawed because the people who were supposed to love you treated you like an unacceptable inconvenience, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not the problem. If you are constantly shrinking your own existence to fit at a table where your presence is barely tolerated, it is time to push your chair back. It is time to walk away. The intense guilt you feel for leaving a toxic family dynamic is just a phantom chain they forged to keep you compliant and useful. You were never too much. You were never too loud, too dramatic, or too demanding. You were simply standing among people who were entirely incapable of giving you what you deserved. Do not wait for them to apologize. Do not wait for them to validate your pain or acknowledge their cruelty. They never will. Your healing begins the exact moment you realize that their approval is completely worthless. Build your own greenhouse. Plant your own roots in soil that actually wants you to thrive. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to build your own greenhouse after someone tried to uproot you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Keep your boundaries absolutely strong, and I will see you in the next story. The greenhouse door clicked shut.